G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Welcome to part 24 of my partial book reading of One Crowded Hour. Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. Episode 24 being the fourth part of chapter 18, Death is a Lady. Okay, so to recoup. Other notable stories evolved through Davis's long association with Cambodia. In November 1969, only 4 months before Prince Sihanouk was overthrown, Davis was the only Western pressman invited to cover Cambodia's independence celebrations. During that visit, Davis stayed at a Buddhist pagoda in the countryside, later overrun by the communists, who executed 12 monks. Just one escaped, May aged 50. The venerable May decided not to turn the other cheek and formed a company of irregular troops from boys who had been his former students and led them into battle. He never carried a weapon, and the only concession he made to danger was to occasionally wear a steel-lined flak jacket. It was quite a sight to see him leading his troops into battle with his saffron robes flowing under his flak jacket. His young troops believed he was protected by the Buddha. May shunned the press, but Neil prevailed on their previous association in the pagoda and filmed a story titled Cambodia's Friar Tuck. It delighted the soldier monk, a long-time Robin Hood fan. Always drawn to inspired eccentrics who tackled problems laterally, even guerrilla warfare, Davis was captivated by an old man, Dan Croc, nicknamed Grandfather Tiger. Davis estimated his age at about 65, and he used to disguise himself as an old peasant, dressed in tattered shorts, and walk ahead of his troops to test the situation. Then he would lead them into battle after putting on a helmet. So you had this old man in shorts, helmet, no shirt, and carrying a staff, walking ahead of his troops. Sometimes he wore boots, although I don't know why, as his feet were as tough as leather. He would walk down the road while his men fanned out on either side because the bullets bounced off him. That is what his men believed, and I'm sure old Dan Croc believed it. To my knowledge, he was never wounded, and there were plenty of stories to back up this superstition. Dan Croc was a stern disciplinarian and earned his name Grandfather Tiger from his habit of giving his young troops a good lathering with his bamboo staff if they stepped out of line. The first time I met him, I thought he was a peasant, but he was introduced as a colonel. He was about to lead an attack and was burning some brush sticks and praying over a pig's head. I took some film of this, and he took a bowl of rice and set it on a tree stump, and explained that he was praying in front of the pig's head for the spirits of soldiers killed in the battle to come and help them. The rice was for the spirit soldiers. He and his men then went into battle and fought very bravely and won. They knew Dan Croc couldn't be killed. But in another battle, Davis wondered if his faith in Dan Croc was misplaced. He and his men were surrounded by Vietnamese communist soldiers. They had no food and only 3 rounds of ammunition left per man. The old man made sure that the besieging soldiers knew that he, Dan Croc, was in command, and ordered his own men to lie low, not to speak, smoke, light fires, or move at all. They were not to open fire unless ordered to. The Vietnamese had heard of Grandfather Tiger and regarded him as a bit of a joke, and after sundown launched their first attack, which was something of a feint to gauge the strength of the Cambodians. However, there wasn't a murmur from inside the village. No sound, no lights, no nothing. This nonplussed them, and they gathered strength and launched another attack about an hour later. This fell a bit short when they discovered that all the shooting and yelling was coming from their side, and it was dark, and they started to think about this old man in there with his reputation, and began to get a bit spooked. They rather nervously called out insulting things to try and get a response from the soldiers inside to reassure themselves. I think that humans were there, with no mystic stuff going on, but there was no response. They launched another half-hearted attack about midnight, but it faded fairly quickly, and mutterings could be heard from about 50 and 60 metres away, and some swearing. All Vietnamese soldiers, communist or not, used to swear a lot. But they were definitely spooked and never did launch another attack. Resupply helicopters came in at first light with fresh ammunition and supplies, and the situation was saved. Old Dan Croc had won out again. Davis firmly believed that Grandfather Tiger in his peasant disguise would have survived Pol Pot atrocities after the fall of Phnom Penh. Always on the lookout for a new angle, Davis took an opportunity in January 1973 to drop in by helicopter to a particularly vicious siege of the little railway town of Romeus, northwest of Phnom Penh. The siege had been going on for 3 weeks. Neil flew in with 2 companions, a Cambodian photographer, Costaud, nicknamed Muscles, and Associated Press photographer Lee Rudakwetch. They took a lot of small arms fire as they came in, and the chopper took off immediately for Phnom Penh. Obviously, the 3 had to overnight at Romeus. They were warmly welcomed by the defenders, about 100 soldiers and 200 part-timers. And what an assortment! It was tailor-made for Davis, who attracted cheerful eccentrics with uncanny magnetism. One old man presented him proudly, ramrod straight, wearing a frayed but recognisable World War I French infantryman's coat. The old soldier was wearing his French and Cambodian campaign ribbons and carrying the oldest working blunderbuss Davis had seen outside a museum. He was over 75 and assured Davis that he was delighted to serve again, although there had been a bit of a gap since he fought with the young de Gaulle in France from 1914 to 1918. The 3 visitors hunkered down with a family group, manning a forward mortar pit with the communist soldiers just across the railway line. Davis, with Cambodia's famous soldier monk, Lieutenant May known as Friar Tuck, or the Friar Tuck of Cambodia. In 1973, the 51-year-old May commanded a territorial unit about 60 kilometres southwest of Phnom Penh. The 3 visitors hunkered down with a family group manning a forward mortar pit with communist soldiers just across the railway line. They were marvellous people. The old man's son was about 60, a leather worker by trade. His rather jolly, robust and saucy wife was about 25 years younger. She took rather a fancy to me, and there were lots of explicit suggestions made. Not helped by Costaud, who suggested Ma take me forcibly and start a harem. Outside their little lean-to shelter were their 2 babies, the 60mm mortar in its pit and a live wire monkey tied to the bare pole of a tree which went up about 10 metres, but had been stripped of all its foliage by constant strikes of shrapnel and bullets. They swore the monkey was their lookout. The little chattering creature would shin up the scratched and battered pole and warn of any attacks from across the railway line. A bare 300 metres away, several hundred Khmer Rouge troops, supported by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong regulars, poured in mortars, automatic rifle fire and B-40 rockets that screamed past the monkey lookout like an express train. Davis was intrigued to find that the 25-year-old Romeus commander, Lieutenant Chan Lim, spoke English and French fluently and had spent some months at the Australian Jungle Training Centre at Canungra in Queensland. The previous commander had been killed in a night assault a few days before. The communist troops knew there were Westerners in Romeus, and it promised to be a rough night, with the strong possibility of the camp being overrun. Through the night, from less than 80 metres away, came mocking voices speaking in Khmer, Vietnamese and Pidgin English. "We know you're in there, Americans. We're coming in to cut your throats," and other similar pleasantries. Lee Rudowich thought we might as well arm ourselves, and Lieutenant Chan said that was not a problem because so many had been killed and wounded, there were plenty of weapons. While Costaud and Rudowich went off looking for weapons, Davis settled down in a dip in the ground on a low stretch of bed he'd scrounged. It had been a long day, and there was a pleasant evening breeze to help lull him to sleep. Gunfire never stopped me from sleeping, but about 20 minutes later Rudy arrived back. "I've got us some weapons, Digger. Hey, Digger!" "Christ, the son of a bitch is asleep." Costard said, "He's resting, mon cher ami. It's a good idea, right?" Davis slept the sleep of the just until 5:30 a.m. when, between intermittent bursts of fire from the besiegers, the defenders heard President Nixon broadcasting on shortwave radio his peace with honour in Indochina message, saying that the war was over. The Cambodians were delighted with this twist and called out the news to the communists outside the fence, then ducked. Shortly afterwards, the three newsmen were whisked away by an American helicopter which was not officially taking part in any combat-related flying. Lieutenant Chan Lim politely invited them to visit again any time. Early in March 1974, Davis filmed an incident that again demonstrated the confused and fearful impact of the Cambodian war on its people. It was also an occasion with a bizarre personal twist for Davis himself. I managed to get to a Khmer Rouge camp, about 30 kilometres southwest of Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge were allied with the Khmer Rouge, but they were not communists. Unlike the communists, they were devout Buddhists and considered themselves nationalists. The Khmer Rouge were considering changing sides, provided the Phnom Penh government assured them of political integration. When Davis visited them, they were camped out in a Buddhist pagoda in a kind of grey zone between the Khmer Rouge and the government forces. I took a chance and joined them. While I was there, they were attacked from the jungle side of the pagoda by the Khmer Rouge, but they fought them off. Less than 2 kilometres on the other side were the government troops, but they didn't take any part one way or the other. Davis filmed the tough Khmer Rouge guerrillas praying in the pagoda. Another group sat in a circle around a teenage soldier playing a haunting Cambodian melody on a bamboo flute. I'd never heard the flute played before or since. It brought tears to my eyes, and some of those wiry guerrillas were sitting there silently, tears rolling down their cheeks. Many of the Khmer Rouge and their families were suffering from malaria. Anticipating that, Davis had brought in hundreds of malaria tablets. After a couple of hours, they relaxed and began talking freely. Davis asked them where they had been fighting during the past few months. "Oh, up and down Highway 4, they said, "mostly past Kompong Spew." Davis had been lightly wounded in the back by shrapnel from a mortar the previous December near a bridge at a town called Mohasang, and told them so. There was hardly a pause. Their 22-year-old battalion commander pointed at a well-built young man sitting on the ground. "He did it." The young soldier blushed self-consciously. "He's the mortar layer," the commander continued, "and we think he's the best. He might not have put the actual round in the tube that wounded you, but he did set the positions of all the mortars. We only had 3 60mm tubes down there, you know." I didn't know. It seemed like the buggers had 20. Anyway, the commander pointed dramatically again at the youth, who was by now on his feet and scuffling the ground with one foot in his embarrassment. "He did it." "Congratulations," Davis said. "All it'll cost you is a cigarette." The young man laughed and handed him a fortune Cambodian cigarette in his fingers, which is the way a guy hands his mate a smoke in Cambodia. The changeover eventually fell through, and the Khmer Rouge returned to the communist side to be killed almost to a man by the Pol Pot madness after 17 April 1975. And there we finally got to the end of chapter 18 of my partial book reading of One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.